I woke to silence in the apartment, her departure leaving a faint trace of perfume. A week later, a letter arrived, $5 million, an inheritance I couldn't reveal. I didn't change my daily schedule, letting the fortune exist unseen. Outside, the world went on. Inside, I held power invisible, absolute, and she had no idea. I lived in Austin, Texas in 2012, in a life that had settled into quiet routines. My days began before sunrise, the engine of my old pickup rattling as I drove to the small workshop where I repaired industrial equipment. Every tool on the bench had its place, every bolt and wire cataloged in my mind. I checked them carefully each morning, testing connections, listening to the subtle hum of machinery, feeling the smooth resistance of gears under my hands. My son Luke slept in the next room, 5 years old and unaware of the fragility that had entered our lives. The morning she left, my wife moved with a strange efficiency. Papers were gone from the desk, clothes folded or packed, her absence leaving the apartment hollow and silent. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces she had touched, searching for something I could hold onto, something to make sense of the betrayal that seemed to float in the air. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and her perfume, a combination that clung to the corners, impossible to air out. I listened for Luke's small steps on the wooden floor, the quietest sound anchoring me to the reality that remained. A week passed before the letter arrived, its envelope thick and official, the seal precise. The lawyer's words were clear. My uncle, who had lived in California and died years before I fully understood his presence in my life, had left me $5 million. The conditions were strict, absolute silence, strict confidentiality, and preservation of the inheritance until Luke reached adulthood. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, and thought about what it meant. Power had arrived uninvited, the temptation of sudden wealth pressing against the boundaries I had carefully built around myself. I walked through the apartment, noting the familiar smells, motor oil from the garage where I kept a small kit for emergencies, the faint scent of Luke's cereal from breakfast still lingering, the musty corners of a rug that had absorbed years of our quiet life. I turned wrenches in my mind, thinking through the mechanics of honesty, the weight of decisions measured in small increments. The sound of Luke's footsteps echoed from the hallway as he padded into the kitchen, soft and rhythmic, a reminder that the ordinary had to endure alongside the extraordinary. I made my choice then in silence, the kind of choice that leaves no announcement and requires no applause. I would live as I always had, keep the inheritance hidden, let the money exist in the background, and preserve the world Luke knew. I would track every detail, the clink of metal on metal, the whir of engines, the faint creak of floorboards, and the quiet hum of a life held together by routine. The decision was mine alone, a test of discipline and character, and I walked through that day as I had all others, carrying both loss and opportunity in the hollow spaces between heartbeats. I continued my work in the workshop, rising before dawn and returning long after the streets had emptied. The routine was unchanged, the hum of machinery and the scent of grease marking each day as it had before. Yet a new weight pressed silently against the edges of my life. Payments for bills and minor luxuries moved quietly through a trust I controlled, invisible to friends and neighbors, shielding them from the knowledge that the rules of my existence had shifted without outward sign. Everything appeared normal, orderly, unremarkable. But beneath it lay a secret that could have rewritten every expectation I once held. I passed her sometimes, my ex-wife, on streets I traveled for work or errands, sometimes glimpsing her face in social media updates. The curve of her smile paired with someone new. The images stirred faint echoes, a shadow of curiosity or longing. Yet I felt no outward reaction. My mind cataloged the sight with the same precision I applied to machines and tools, observing without interference, noting angles, distances, and expressions, but keeping my emotions compartmentalized. I had to preserve the life that remained, the life Luke depended on, against the silent allure of wealth. Every morning I began the same way, checking each tool, tightening bolts, listening to the subtle changes in the tension of metal and wood, ensuring everything performed as it should. I prepared Luke's breakfast, packed lunches with the exact care I once gave engines and devices, and supervised the minor tasks of a small apartment with a meticulous eye. The smallest disturbance, the misaligned wrench, a scuffed floorboard, the spill of cereal, demanded attention, grounding me in reality, preventing my thoughts from drifting toward what the money could buy or what it could erase. The internal struggle was quiet, private, an ever-present awareness that I could escape scarcity with a word, a decision, a moment of indulgence. But I held firm. Discipline became a kind of armor. The steady care for my son the only true measure of strength. The temptation to change everything was cataloged and analyzed, the possibilities weighed and then set aside, leaving me anchored to the modest life I had chosen. At night, when the apartment settled into silence, I walked to the windows, looking out over the streets of Austin. I tracked the slow alterations in my neighborhood, the subtle construction, the shifting traffic patterns, the way a new tree cast shadows across sidewalks once bare. I logged these details in my mind as if they were tools, instruments for maintaining balance, small observations that kept me steady. In those hours, the world felt vast and yet intimate, every motion and sound a tether to reality. The city breathed, and I measured it, absorbing its changes with careful attention, letting the hidden fortune remain precisely that, hidden, and letting the ordinary rhythms of life hold me in place. I began to move cautiously, letting a fraction of the inheritance flow into the world without leaving a trace of its origin. I paid medical bills for neighbors who had hesitated at clinic doors, their faces lighting with relief I could not witness directly. Broken bicycles in the alley, rusted chains and flat tires became projects in my garage late at night. I repaired them quietly, leaving them at doorsteps with notes of encouragement that carried no hint of my involvement. The engines of old cars sputtered back to life under my hands, their owners' gratitude expressed in hesitant smiles and murmurs of thanks, fleeting yet deeply grounding. I sent small gifts to schools, funds directed toward science kits, lab equipment, and supplies that students would never trace to me. I imagined the young faces bending over microscopes, the thrill of discovery sparking in eyes unclouded by hardship. Each night I cataloged these moments mentally, noting the subtle changes my interventions caused, the quiet wonder, the small but meaningful excitement. It was a form of currency I could feel, an exchange measured in respect, joy, and the unspoken acknowledgement of care. Walking through the neighborhood became an exercise in observation, a ritual that sharpened my understanding of impact. I noted a repaired roof, a bicycle standing upright again, a student carrying a backpack that had once been patched with duct tape. These were the markers of progress, tiny victories that carried weight far beyond their material measure. Each act reinforced a principle I had not known I needed to understand so clearly. Wealth alone meant nothing if it did not translate into action that served others without expectation. At home, Luke's laughter became the mirror for these efforts, his curiosity untainted by knowledge of the money behind it. I watched him with quiet pride, realizing that influence could be exerted not through command or display, but through subtle acts that shaped reality without drawing attention to the actor. In this, I felt an unfamiliar clarity, a growing strength rooted in purpose rather than possession. I measured my days not by hours or tools, but by the traces of my work left in the world. A tire spinning smoothly on the street, a parent exhaling a breath they had been holding too long, a student bending closer to a microscope with fascination. The inheritance, immense and hidden, became secondary to these indicators of moral power. I had discovered a form of wealth that could not be stolen, could not be counted, only observed in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that small, deliberate choices could ripple outward, shaping lives without ever demanding acknowledgement. I met Elizabeth quietly, without anticipation, in the bright but calm spaces of the local children's shelter. Her presence was steady, measured, like sunlight filtering through a window, neither intrusive nor demanding. I began to notice the small rhythms of her gestures, the way she adjusted a blanket around a child, the patience in her hands when guiding little fingers to draw or write. Over time, our interactions developed a rhythm of their own. I observed her attentiveness to Luke, the careful way she encouraged his curiosity, and I felt a quiet sense of relief in sharing the responsibility of his care. We planned small projects together, simple educational exercises that could fit within the shelter or the few classrooms we could access. Each initiative required careful thought, careful allocation of hidden resources, and attention to detail. Elizabeth approached every task without pretension, offering suggestions and support without ever asking for recognition. I found a strange comfort in this, realizing that trust and collaboration could exist without spectacle or explanation. My mornings gained new texture. Luke's wakefulness became gentler, his eyes meeting mine with more confidence, his small voice carrying more warmth than before. Elizabeth's presence in these routines, helping with breakfast, tidying toys, checking lists of school supplies, made the household quieter yet more alive. I watched Luke begin to understand that care and attention mattered far more than material things. I saw him pausing to help a younger child, sharing a toy he had once clutched alone, and recognized that he was internalizing the lessons I had long tried to model in silence. I noticed the effect on myself as well. My vigilance over tools, schedules, and household duties took on a different weight. They were no longer merely obligations or exercises in control. They were part of a framework of stability and trust that Elizabeth and I were building for Luke. I could release some of the tension I had carried alone, feeling the weight of presence and continuity rather than fear or solitude. Through these quiet, shared efforts, I began to understand the true dimension of connection. It was not in grand gestures or verbal affirmation, but in consistent, reliable attention. Elizabeth became part of the unseen architecture of our lives, a stabilizing presence that reinforced the lessons of patience, care, and moral discipline. I felt the world open slightly, not through wealth or power, but through the steady influence of presence and the creation of a life in which trust and subtle guidance mattered more than recognition or reward. A month before the final conditions of the inheritance were set to expire, a quiet tension settled over my days. My former wife appeared in my awareness more insistently, not through confrontation, but through a request cloaked in civility. She sought financial support for a new business, her life outwardly flourishing in ways mine had not since the divorce. The contrast was stark and unsettling. A flicker of resentment surfaced, the urge to assert superiority against the backdrop of her success. I felt the weight of temptation pressing gently, almost imperceptibly, against the disciplined boundaries I had built around myself. I continued my mornings with unchanged precision, rising early to check tools, organize small repairs, and prepare for the day. Luke's needs remained a grounding force, his breakfast, his school preparations, the way he ran ahead of me down the quiet streets of Austin as we walked to the small park near our home. I observed him carefully, noting how he responded to attention without attachment to material reward, how his curiosity for small experiments and projects revealed an innate appreciation for patience and effort. I spent the afternoons in the workshop, repairing equipment, restoring bicycles for children, and quietly funding educational supplies. The work itself became a meditation, each nut and bolt a measure of my steadiness. I kept careful records in my mind of who received aid, of how small gestures transformed outcomes. In these acts, I felt a pulse of control and purpose stronger than any wealth displayed in the world outside. Evenings were the hardest. The awareness of my former wife's request lingered, an invisible test I could neither ignore nor openly confront. I watched the city's lights from the back porch, noting the movement of neighbors, the quiet hum of traffic, the occasional laughter of children distant in the streets. Each moment became a reflection of restraint, a reminder that my strength lay not in sudden revelation or vindication, but in constancy and integrity. By the end of the month, the temptation had circled me like a shadow, but never penetrated my practice of daily life. I saw clearly that the inheritance was less a reward than a measure of character. My adherence to routine, my choice to act with discretion, to help quietly, to remain emotionally present for Luke, had shaped a resilience that no external display of wealth could replicate. The moral test was passed not through defiance or cunning, but through the quiet assertion of who I had chosen to be, in every repeated, deliberate act of ordinary life. The day the inheritance conditions finally concluded arrived quietly, without ceremony or fanfare. I gained full access to the funds, a reality that could have rewritten the contours of my existence overnight. Yet I felt no urgency to alter the life I had carefully constructed. I continued my mornings as before, checking tools, preparing Luke's breakfast, ensuring that the small domestic rituals remained consistent. The money, once a distant and almost abstract possibility, now became a means to extend impact rather than transform personal comfort. I established educational and social funds discreetly, targeting programs that nurtured talent in children who would otherwise have been overlooked, securing resources for learning, safety, and growth. Elizabeth's presence became a quiet anchor. Her support, gentle but steady, reinforced the routines and principles I had maintained for years. She participated in Luke's life with unwavering consistency, helping organize projects, overseeing small workshops, and sharing attention in ways that strengthened the fabric of our little household. The rhythms of our days were unremarkable to outsiders but precise and sustaining in their effect. Shared meals, evening walks through quiet streets, the preparation of small lessons and activities for neighborhood children, the subtle calibration of ordinary life into a framework of care and reliability. I spent hours observing the city from familiar vantage points, noting subtle changes that had grown from the anonymous support I had provided over the years. Repairs made to playground equipment, scholarships quietly funded, basic necessities delivered to struggling families, all left traces in the streets, the parks, and the schools. Children moved with a confidence they had not known before. Parents displayed relief and gratitude I never claimed. The city itself, in its modest transformation, became a testament to quiet perseverance rather than visible wealth. Evenings often found me alone on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills, the light casting long shadows across the rooftops and streets of Austin. In those moments, I felt a fullness of life that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with constancy, responsibility, and moral clarity. Each day had acquired its own meaning, independent of external circumstances. I recognized that true wealth lay not in displays or recognition, but in the creation of stability, the cultivation of trust, and the ability to extend care to others without expectation. As Luke slept and Elizabeth moved quietly about our home, I sensed that the lessons of the past years had settled deeply. The discipline of routine, the restraint in temptation, the dedication to small, deliberate acts of kindness. They had shaped a life resilient to misfortune and indifferent to superficial gain. My gaze lingered on the horizon as night approached, the city quieting beneath the stars. I felt calm, confident, and purposeful, aware that each new day would bring opportunities to act with integrity, to help, to guide, to witness growth, and to continue living a life defined not by wealth itself, but by the way it could be wielded to sustain, protect, and strengthen those I cared for.